Every July, the same thing happened behind the Caldwell County packing house. Trucks rolled in loaded with peaches. By afternoon, a second pile had formed out back, a mountain of fruit nobody wanted. By sunset, that pile was already humming with bees. Nobody thought twice about it. It happened every summer. It had happened for as long as anyone could remember. But one question kept coming back to a 26-year-old named Marin Tillis, standing at the edge of that pile with a peach in her hand. Why did the rejected fruit smell sweeter than anything sold inside the store? To understand what she was looking at, you have to understand how a peach earns its way onto a grocery shelf. It isn't taste. It's skin. A hard summer rain rolls through 2 days before harvest. The fruit swells faster than the skin can stretch, and the peach splits along its seam. Sometimes it's a hairline. Sometimes it splits clean to the pit. The flesh underneath is untouched, often better than untouched, because the tree poured everything it had into that peach right before the storm hit. Sugar is concentrating in the final push toward ripeness. None of that matters on the packing line. Grocery contracts are written around appearance, not flavor. There's a reason for that. A bruised or split peach doesn't survive a truck ride, a warehouse shelf, and a week in a produce bin the way a firm, unblemished one does. The industry isn't wrong that split fruit is fragile. It's only wrong about what fragile is worth. A peach that fails inspection gets pulled off the belt, dropped into a bin, and driven out back at the end of the day. The man who ran that line was named Curtis Ames. 22 years on the job. Not a cruel man, just a man following math the industry had written long before he got there. Grocery stores don't buy peaches, he told Marin the first time she asked about the reject pile. They buy the idea of peaches. She didn't have an answer for that. Not yet. She just knew she couldn't stop thinking about how much fruit was sitting behind that dock, and how none of it seemed to be going anywhere except a compost pit. If you enjoy true stories about rural ingenuity and the hidden opportunities most people walk straight past, consider subscribing to Hardacre Stories. We share stories like this one every week. The first July, Marin didn't have a plan. She had a part-time job at the feed store, a converted garage behind her parents' house, and a habit of noticing things other people ignored. She asked Curtis if she could take a few crates home. He shrugged, said sure, it's going in the compost anyway. She made jam. It was fine. Good even. But it wasn't the thing that kept her up at night. What kept her up was a smell. The way split peaches, left out in July heat for even half a day, seemed to concentrate. She didn't know the science yet. She just knew something was happening in that fruit that wasn't happening in the fruit sold 2 miles away under fluorescent lights. That winter, she found the answer in a library book on fermentation. Damaged fruit, left to sit even briefly, loses moisture through its skin faster than intact fruit. As the water evaporates, the sugar concentration inside actually rises. For jam, that barely matters. But for fermentation, sugar is everything. It's the raw fuel yeast converts into alcohol and flavor. A slightly damaged peach, it turned out, wasn't a lesser version of a perfect one. For cider, it was arguably the better raw material. The very thing that made a peach worthless to a grocery store was the same thing that made it valuable to a fermenter. She didn't tell anyone what she was planning. She wanted to know if it would actually work before she said it out loud. Her first attempt that 2nd July was a disaster. A second-hand fermenting bucket, a hand-crank juicer that jammed every third turn. 3 weeks later, the batch had turned into something closer to vinegar than cider. She poured it out behind the garage and didn't tell anyone why she'd been crying. The second batch was better. Not good. Better. She brought a jar to her cousin's cookout that August and watched people's faces closely while they tried it. Her uncle said it tasted like a peach that had gotten into a fight with a lemon. Nobody asked for seconds. But something had shifted. She wasn't asking herself if split peaches could become something anymore. She was asking how. By the 3rd July, Curtis noticed something new. The same young woman who used to take a few crates home now showed up every single day the line ran, asking for whatever was headed to the compost pit that afternoon. "What exactly are you doing with all this?" he finally asked. She didn't answer. She just handed him a bottle. He tried it standing at the loading dock, the same dock he'd hauled thousands of pounds of worthless fruit away from for 22 years. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he read the label again. Tillis Peach Cider, made from rescued fruit, and looked out at the reject bins like he was seeing them for the first time. "Huh," was all he said. But he came back for a second bottle the following week, and he didn't pay for that one either. He brought it home. Word doesn't move fast in a county like Caldwell. It moves slow and only through people who already trust each other. She built a stand at the end of her parents' driveway, plywood counter, hand-painted sign. First weekend, 6 bottles, 4 to people she already knew. Second weekend, one of those 4 came back and bought a case. Then came the diner. Wendell Ruiz had run the Route 9 diner for 18 years, off a menu that hadn't changed since the Clinton administration. His register clerk brought a bottle home. Wendell tried it behind his own counter and said, "Where do I buy a case of this?" She didn't have a case. She had maybe 15 bottles left in her whole operation. He put a sign in his window anyway. Customers started asking before she delivered a single bottle. If you're enjoying watching an ordinary person solve an extraordinary problem, a quick like helps more people find stories like this one. And it genuinely helps a small channel like ours. Now, back to the orchard. A diner wanting a case meant Maren wasn't running a hobby anymore. She was running a business without the equipment to survive being one. So she went back to Curtis, not for a few crates this time, but for a standing arrangement. Every reject bin, every July. Hers. He agreed. No charge. The fruit was headed for compost regardless, and hauling it 2 miles to her place cost the packing house nothing. One condition, she picked it up herself. Same day it came off the line. What she didn't know yet was that solving one problem was about to hand her 3 more. The diner's demand meant she needed more juice than a hand-crank press could produce. She bought a commercial press with savings she didn't really have to spare. 2 weeks into her busiest harvest yet, the gear mechanism cracked clean through. She spent 3 days pressing peaches by hand, wrapping fruit in cheesecloth and twisting until her forearms ached, just to cover orders she'd already promised. That same week, an older man walked up to her stand for the first time. Hollis Whitlock, 3 generations of his family running Whitlock Orchard, the very operation that supplied the packing house Maren's fruit came from. He tasted a sample, nodded slowly. "Didn't figure anybody could do something worthwhile with cull fruit," he said. It wasn't quite an insult. It wasn't quite a compliment. Hollis had spent 40 years believing a peach's worth was decided the moment an inspector looked at its skin. He'd built a career, a reputation, and a family business on that belief. A girl with a plywood stand telling him the worthless fruit might be the better fruit. It wasn't just surprising. It was, in a quiet way, unsettling. What Maren didn't know was that Hollis had reasons of his own to be paying closer attention than usual. Whitlock Orchard's fresh fruit sales had been sliding 2 seasons running. Bigger distributors undercutting on price. A couple of grocery contracts lost to fruit trucked in from out of state. The orchard that once supplied half the county's shelves was quietly fighting to keep the accounts it had left. It was Wendell who solved the press problem, floating her alone out of his own pocket. "You paid for my sign in the window 100 times over," he said. Then a young reporter named Priya Deshmukh, who normally covered school board meetings, heard about the broken press through her aunt, one of Marin's regulars. Her article, From Reject Pile to Recipe, did more in 1 week than 2 years of word of mouth had managed. People started driving in from 3 towns over. A brewery in the next county called about wholesale, and the county health department called too, informing her that a stand selling fermented beverages at that volume needed licensing she'd never known existed. The licensing process 8 months and money she didn't have. A commercial kitchen requirement meant she couldn't keep bottling in her parents' garage. For a while, it looked like the article that built her audience might be the thing that shut her down. She sat on the porch steps that fall, the same steps where she'd first bitten into a split peach 3 summers earlier, and told her mother she was thinking about quitting. Her mother set down her mending. Curtis called last week. Wanted to know if you needed anything for harvest. Said half the packing line's been asking after your cider. It turned out word had been moving in a direction Marin hadn't noticed. The workers who'd watched her haul reject crates for 3 straight summers had become some of her most loyal customers. When the article mentioned her licensing struggle, several of them, along with Wendell and a handful of regulars, quietly pooled enough to cover the remaining fees and dropped the envelope at the feed store, where she still worked her shifts. She almost didn't accept it. Her mother reminded her that turning down help from people who believed in you wasn't independence. It was just stubbornness wearing a nicer coat. By the following spring, Tillis Peach Cider had its license, a small rented space behind the old feed store for proper bottling, and standing weekly orders from 3 restaurants. The plywood stand became timber with a covered porch where people could sit and taste before they bought. A wedding venue 2 towns over began serving her cider exclusively. Tourists heading to the mountains started stopping just because they'd read about it. The turning point came the following August at the county fair, when a blind tasting was set up in the agriculture tent. Local ciders and preserves, judged by a panel that included 2 commercial growers and, almost by accident, Hollis Whitlock himself, filling in for a judge who'd canceled. Nobody on the panel knew whose bottles were whose. Hollis tasted 6 samples and set one aside without comment, writing something on his card he didn't share. When the numbers were read aloud, his highest score belonged to sample 4, Tillis Peach Cider. Made entirely from fruit his own industry had spent generations calling worthless. He didn't say much that day, but a neighbor later said he stood by the reject bins at the packing house the following week, picked up a split peach, turned it over in his hand, and just looked at it for a long moment before setting it back down. Have you ever seen something everyone else considered worthless turn into something genuinely valuable? I'd love to hear that story in the comments below. Nobody set out to compare Marin's numbers to Whitlock Orchards, least of all Marin. But somewhere around her 5th summer, the evidence became impossible to ignore. The waiting lines at the stand stretched past what the little porch could seat. Production had scaled twice. Regional food writers had started using her name in the same sentence as towns 3 hours away. And still, every July, the reject bins kept filling behind the packing house. And every July, Marin kept hauling them out herself. Hollis became one of her steadiest advocates, telling anyone who'd listened that the girl had built something out of fruit he'd personally watched bulldozed into compost his entire life. Whole career sorting fruit by what's wrong with it, he told Wendell one afternoon. Took a 26-year-old girl to show me what was right with it instead. I spent 40 years measuring peaches by what an inspector could see. She measured them by what they could become. Curtis still never charged her a cent for the fruit. "Wouldn't feel right billing you for garbage," he said once, half joking, though even he'd stopped quite believing the word applied anymore. Somewhere in that fifth season, without any single dramatic moment marking it, the math quietly settled itself, the way math eventually does. The fruit that once cost the packing house nothing and profited no one had become the foundation of a business now bringing in more than the orchard made, moving its perfect, unblemished peaches through grocery distribution. If you enjoy authentic stories about craftsmanship, resilience, and rural ingenuity, subscribe to Hardacre Stories so you don't miss the next one. Every July, the trucks still arrive behind the packing house. Fruit split open by summer rain still gets pulled off the belt. The workers still sort by the same standards they always have. No blemishes, no splits, nothing a shopper might have to explain at checkout. The packing house still can't sell a single one of those peaches. But they don't go to the compost pit anymore. They roll 2 miles down the road to a timber stand at the edge of the highway, where a line sometimes forms before the doors even open, toward a business that now earns more from fruit the world rejected than an entire orchard earns from fruit the world approved of. People don't come for perfect peaches. They come for what everyone else had overlooked. The world often measures value by appearance. The wisest people learn to measure it by potential.